Thank you so much. I think I'm supposed to bring, in a sense, the national security perspective to this. And I've worked on national security and foreign policy issues as a lawyer, as a policymaker, as an intelligence officer. And I've also had the opportunity to work in all three branches of government, which honestly I think has told me that all three branches of government have a fair amount of dysfunction. So it's been an education in that experience. But what I want to do is actually defend the international order today, in a way. I'd like to talk about it from the experience of somebody who started in government as a civil servant and who's seen through a variety of different ways the challenges that we've experienced in within the United States in actually trying to advance the international order. And yet I've seen the value that it has brought to the United States. And I've also, in my national security positions, seen the critical nature of us continuing to pursue an international order, in my view. And I think when I say that, I mean a rules-based international order advanced by US leadership that promotes peace, security, and opportunity through stronger cooperation to meet global challenges. So it matters what it says. I think to say a point, it's not that any international order is okay, but the point is that it is, nevertheless, having an international order is critical. And I think to begin that conversation, you sort of have to get through that first discussion about why it's so important to engage with the rest of the world. And some of the statistics that were brought up this morning, and a Pew poll, actually, that I think Stephen Walt mentioned last night, I found to be particularly interesting, but I'll just repeat it. 57% of Americans want the United States to deal with their own problems and let other countries deal with their own problems as best they can. That is a fascinating poll, right? That well over a majority of the country believe that it's possible to do that. And from a national security and foreign policy perspective, I find that just so unrealistic. It's one of these things that, when I think about the national security issues that the United States is facing, I think about things like infectious diseases. So for example, an easily transmissible pathogen that can be caught through respiratory means, even if it only affects 1% of the population that actually gets it, within 6 months will have affected every corner of the world. And that's an extraordinarily timeline that you're on, basically, if you find out that there is such a pathogen that could then become a pandemic in that way. When you think about states that fail across the world, and what that means, uncontrolled migration issues, the potential for terrorist groups to take advantage of those opportunities. That means we have to care about that, just from a national security perspective, let alone a variety of other perspectives. Cyber attacks that can be launched from essentially anywhere that can affect our domestic security in a very significant way. The production or proliferation of biological, chemical, nuclear weapons. Things, again, that you don't want to have to deal with in the United States. You want to actually manage the threat well before it gets to our shores. And if we're going to do that, I think we have to understand what's happening in the world so that we're able to actually effectively detect and disrupt threats before they get to our shores. And we need to, and this is sort of the next key piece to this from my perspective in establishing an international order that makes sense, you need to establish partnerships and mechanisms to prevent such threats from occurring to begin with, right? That's the key piece, if you can possibly do it, is actually to develop mechanisms that allow other places where they tend to arise, right? First of all, to be resilient and to address them initially when they come up so that they don't go beyond, but also to start to begin to help other countries address the drivers of those threats. So things like counterterrorism, anybody who sits in a counterterrorism center in the United States government who's been doing this for a while, even if they're focused on kinetic action and on basically, you know, they're in the military and they're working on counterterrorism, and if you have a conversation with them and you ask them, what are you doing? What are you doing to prevent these threats? They'll say, well, we're working on counterterrorism. And if you have a conversation with them and you ask them, what are you doing to prevent these threats? They'll say, well, we're working on counterterrorism. And if you have a conversation with them and you ask them, what are you doing to prevent these threats? They'll say, well, we're working on counterterrorism. And if you have a conversation with them and you ask them, what are you doing to prevent these threats? They'll say, well, we're working on counterterrorism. And if you have a conversation with them and you ask them, what are you doing to prevent these threats? They'll say, well, we're working on counterterrorism. And if you have a conversation with them and you ask them, what are you doing to prevent these threats? They'll say, well, we're working on counterterrorism. And if you have a conversation with them and you ask them, what are you doing to prevent th what are the drivers of counterterrorism is what you're doing, the most important piece of the counterterrorism fight, in a sense. And really, to a one, I would tell you they would say no. They'd say the most important piece of what we do is actually getting to those societies to help them deliver services, to actually govern in their areas so that the people who are growing up in those countries have an opportunity, have hope, have a job, have a mechanism by which to express themselves within that country. And all of those things are critical to us actually addressing a threat that clearly Americans believe are important. So in that context, we have been building partnerships and mechanisms, right, around the world for well over 100 years, going back even longer than that, through what I think of as the backbone of an international order, which are treaties. International agreements governed by international law between states or between states and organizations. And in many respects, when we think about what we did in World War II, as I think about it, the greatest generation fought for an international order of laws and institutions from which we have benefited over the last 70 years in untold ways, that was building on an international order that had started to develop prior to that point. But we have to work to maintain and evolve that framework so that it actually keeps up. And so in that context, that means that that phenomenal order that we were basically building all of this period of time has to actually evolve with new events that occur, new landscape that we're dealing with, not just from a national security perspective, but also from a foreign policy perspective. And before I get to how I think that needs to evolve and what some of the challenges are there, I just want to pause for a moment to talk about the advantages I've seen of that framework in the context of my work and ways that you might not even realize. I suspect some of you, at least, probably a lot of you already know of treaties that have touched you, but some of you may not think of the things that I think of when I think of treaties. So whenever you send an email or make a telephone call internationally, or for that matter, send a letter, if any of you still do that on an international basis, all of those things happen because of treaties that were set up many, many years ago. One of the most interesting ones is the Universal Postal Union, which is an international organization that is basically the basis of us being able to do international mail. But another thing, anytime you get on a plane and you're flying internationally, the standards have been set through an organization, again, that was established in a treaty called the Chicago Convention that established the International Civil Aviation Organization. So many treaties that are out there are ones that affect your life, that create an international order, that actually are things we rely on in a very practical way that you may not think of. When we dealt with Ebola and it swept through West Africa, we turned to the World Health Organization. When we dealt with a worldwide recession, we went to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, we went to the World Bank to get help, essentially, in relation to other countries and helping them get out of those recession periods. When we're trying to maintain a fragile peace in different parts of the world, like South Sudan or the Kashmir or Haiti for that matter, we turn to the United Nations and the peacekeeping forces that are there to try to help us in those scenarios. When we're talking about protecting intellectual property of individuals in the United States, there's a very old treaty-based system for doing that. That is what Americans rely on in many scenarios. When we're talking about businesses that want to go do business in another country and they don't want to be doubly taxed, essentially, for the income they're making, right? There are tax agreements and tax treaties that go through the Senate that deal with that. All of those things are based on treaties. When it comes to law enforcement, getting extradition, dealing with counterterrorism, finding mutual legal assistance treaties, all of these things are part of what makes all of these work, right? And yet, what I found is that when I worked in the Senate, it was becoming increasingly hard to actually get treaties through the Senate to get advice and consent. A really remarkable difficulty in that respect. So let me just give you some figures to give you a sense of it. Since 1960, the US Senate has provided advice and consent to ratify over 800 treaties, a rate of more than one treaty every month, right? And between 1995 and 2000, when President Clinton was in office and Jesse Helms was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate approved over 140 treaties, or an average of 23 treaties a year. And that includes, by the way, major treaties. Chemical Weapons Convention was done during that period. START Treaty, Big Arms Control Treaty, labor rights treaties, law enforcement treaties, environmental treaties, a whole slew of treaties were done during that period. But listen to this, since 2009, 21 treaties have been approved. A little over 2 a year. That's about a tenth of what was done during Jesse Helms' period. That's pretty remarkable. And since the Trump administration came in, not one treaty has been sent to the Senate. So what does that cost us? I personally think in the context of current domestic politics, we've been unable to have what is essentially an honest, nuanced conversation about international agreements and international engagements. The fact that over 50% of the population thinks that it would be okay not to engage, and based on the numbers, and I believe them, and I've seen that before too, it's not just a Republican or a Democrat issue. It's a significant issue through the country that we have not actually been able to articulate effectively the cost of not engaging, the importance of engaging, the enormous value that we receive in this country as a consequence of engaging and of the international order that we've built. But what we've seen in so many places is that that international order that we built is under siege. We don't invest the resources in it that we used to. Even from a Democrat and a Republican president that actually believes, so President Bush, too, in a sense, and as in the 43rd president, and President Obama, obviously, both of them in many respects, although had very different views, obviously, on policy issues, but nevertheless, both of them pushed a number of treaties. Both of them pushed to provide funding for various organizations and saw the value in developing those organizations, which frequently requires amendments to treaties, but neither one of them were capable of actually getting that agenda through Congress. And when I look to the future for national security threats, to give you just an example of where I see it so important, I think this is one of the most critical tools that the United States has to address the threats that we're facing today. So I'll get particularly wonky now for a moment, but in the context of national security, one of the paradigms that we consistently faced were scenarios where you had essentially state actor asymmetric threats. So when I talk about that, what I'm thinking of are as follows: places where a state actor in a adversarial relationship or in a mixed adversarial relationship would look for high value assets of the United States that they could hold at risk at relatively low cost to them. Right, so a high value thing to us, low cost to them, and they could do it in a non-conventionally escalatory way. So what I'm thinking, an example of this, sort of the most obvious example of this is cyber, right? And in many of the places that I'll describe this, in a way the strength that we have as a country also creates a kind of a vulnerability, right? So we obviously, more than really any other country in the world, I'd say, derive enormous value from our digital efforts, right? And we would say, you know, enormous amount of the cyber infrastructure that exists in the world today is in the United States. It's not just our government that relies on it, it's also our private sector, it's our population. We have put, I think it's something, figures have varied, but I think all of them are put over 90% of the population in the United States is on the internet. We've invested billions into things like smart water infrastructure. We have over 50% of our households are now attached to smart meters. We have an enormous amount of, you know, digital assets, private sector interest, all of these things. So we clearly benefit from and are on the internet. And yet, that's a high value asset to us, but we are also vulnerable through it. And there are many countries that are interested in holding that at risk. It's relatively low cost to them because they can do it from, with a few folks in their country to get smart on hacking and doing things along those lines. And yet at the same time, they can do it in a non-conventionally escalatory way, which means that they can take action that doesn't actually provide us with a basis under international law necessarily for responding with the use of force, a sort of a conventional way to respond, right? But moreover, even short of a use of force, because we don't have a big normative framework that lays out the lines for what's acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable behavior, they can take action in a way that doesn't easily translate to a response from our system, in a sense. And we've started to build a normative framework. During the Obama administration, we put out a variety of key sort of normative pieces, such as you shouldn't attack critical infrastructure, you shouldn't essentially take action to pursue commercial gain under certain circumstances for your country, that type of thing. But the reality is we haven't defined what actually constitutes a use of force, or an armed attack, as some people call it, within the cyberspace. And we haven't identified a lot of rules getting to that point, right? And as a consequence, it's very difficult to galvanize, essentially, multilateral support for a response when something happens, because you haven't already established this is a line that is unacceptable to cross. It's easier to make mistakes. It's harder to develop a kind of an escalatory ladder, which is useful in these circumstances. When somebody pushes you, you push back a little bit, you sort of find a way to do it before everything goes to, nuclear option, so to speak. And this is the kind of thing that we would generally start to flesh out in a multilateral framework, where we would start to begin to agree on rules of the road, what's acceptable, what's not, how do we approach it. It doesn't need to be a treaty necessarily, but it is one of those things where you start to develop that in an international forum, and you start to talk to other states about how you do it, and you develop mechanisms so that you can talk to each other quickly in the event of a crisis, and you do all of those types of things. But generally, that is what ultimately leads to a treaty over time. But we know how difficult it is in our domestic system to do those sorts of things. And so we have constraints on us as the United States in that context, and it makes it more difficult. Another area I would put on the table as this kind of asymmetric state actor threat is energy, where we've seen other countries, Russia in particular, use energy as a way of manipulating certain things and garnering influence. In those scenarios. But another one is actually one you might not think of, migration. Another one is space. That's another area where, again, can hold at high risk things that are of great value to the United States, relatively low cost, and in a non-conventionally escalatory way, because there isn't a sufficient framework, in a sense, that gets developed. But all of these are the kinds of things that you would see US leadership on. And what I'll end on is just to show you how it is that we used, like in this framework, how it is we used an international framework to get at that threat previously. And I'll just take the law of the sea as a perfect example. Freedom of navigation is a high value asset to the United States. It's critical to our private sector for trade. It's critical to our military so that we can actually manage not just the defense of the country, but also dealing with allies and defending them in the event of attacks, other things like that. But we can't put a battleship in every strait around the world. We can't possibly enforce it just through brute force. And as a consequence, we very much supported and pushed for a regime for the law of the sea that would protect freedom of navigation, that would establish just the kinds of rules that I'm describing that you would want to have in the context of cyber, but for the law of the sea. So things like, you can transit within 12 nautical miles of an island owned by another country, but you have to do it in a continuous way, and it gets called innocent passage in that scenario. You can't just stop and sit there and hang out for a while, right? Like, there are certain things you can and can't do, and when you violate those rules, it's not that you can use force to respond to them per se, but rather that you have an international consensus as a consequence of all of the countries that are a party to the treaty that is an unacceptable thing to do, and therefore you can respond to it in an appropriate and a proportionate way. And it gives you the strength, essentially, to be able to manage these issues without having to use force in every scenario. And it gives you the escalatory ladder, and it gives you the sense of, we all know what's happening when this ship does this, and why, and how it is, like when it's crossing a line and when it's not. So again, that's the kind of thing that we should be doing right now that we're not able to engage in when we're not engaging internationally, and when we're not able to say that when we bring back a treaty to the United States, it'll be something that can be considered by the Senate in a bipartisan way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Morgan. Thank you.
Thank you, Avril. And the first thing I think of when you sketched out for us these high-value threats, and or rather high-value things for the United States that are asymmetrical, hard to detect, hard to define, how to fight back against. I don't know if everyone here is with me. I'm thinking of Russian interference in the American election. That's kind of the obvious one that jumps out at me. So when I list that as an example, and of course they were using all sorts of things that maybe we in the general public and even the press who covered it so closely, I was covering national security at the time, we weren't aware at the beginning of these bots and the troll farms, and we weren't aware of how they were getting the influence out. You were aware. You were earlier deputy CIA director, and then you were deputy national security advisor. So as soon as it became clear what the Russians were doing, why didn't or couldn't the Obama administration do more to stop it or to call it out and make it obvious during the time of the election?
So there's so many layers to that question, and we could have a whole nother half hour on the Russian election. Yeah, exactly. But I'll give you a few things. First of all, I was aware, probably, obviously, I hope more than the average person about what was happening, but I certainly wasn't aware of everything. And I think that's just the nature of intelligence and how it works, essentially. And we will continue to learn more. We still probably don't know everything about what's happened. And so that's just, you continue to get educated over time. We did actually make public what was happening. Essentially, as soon as the intelligence community could come together and say, yes, we agree, it's Russia that's interfering in the election, and we have sufficient confidence across the board that we're willing to say this. We did that in an October 7th statement that, in 2015, that unfortunately was also the same day that the Billy Bush tapes came out. And
2016.
2016. And so completely got shut off of the news cycle. But one of the things that's interesting about that too is that, it's true that this is a part of what I was describing in the sense that it fits the paradigm. There's so many reasons why that was a particularly complicated piece of work. But one thing that I would say in relation to what I was just saying is that one of the things we discussed, because the Russians are known for having interfered in elections, our own in the past, and also other countries' elections, and countries in Europe and so on. And so we had discussions about whether or not there would be a way to actually have a kind of a multilateral response that would sanction the Russians for taking action in this area. And like so many things in the context of elections, just taking even the politics out of it, it's not uncomplicated, right? You sort of sit there and you have to figure out exactly what is the line that you as a country are going to be comfortable saying is unacceptable, right? What does interference in an election mean? And so that's the kind of conversation that there is clearly a line, but you have to think that through over time with your partners, not in the midst of a crisis, if you're actually going to be able to respond to it effectively, right? Because many people perceive us as meaning the United States, of having interfered in elections in other countries, right? Because we've taken a position on either the candidates or with respect to a particular issue that is associated with one candidate so much that makes the things, or because they believe that, the CIA or others have interfered. There's a variety of things that are out there, and so you need to figure that out, not in the moment, but actually prior to, so that you can develop that kind of discussion and you actually have a line that everybody's lined up to that then they can respond to. And it would have made for a much more effective response from an international perspective, in addition to what we did do, obviously, from a domestic perspective.
Of course, the things that people think that we interfered in other elections, I mean, in the case of Guatemala and Chile, there, was truth to it. We did interfere. I hope we're no longer doing that anymore. And you can assure us, since you were at the CIA recently, hopefully we're not doing that anymore. But okay, so looking at that, we have breaking news.
I can assure you that we can't do premature. Please don't let that be. Yes, exactly.
But so we have breaking news on this. Yesterday, Bob Mueller's investigation yielded these 13 indictments for Russian individuals and 3 Russian entities that the DOJ says were involved in trying to destabilize our elections. So give us a little preview from the vantage point you used to hold. What's next with this? Are there real consequences that can take place, either for Russia or for any Americans who might have been involved?
No, I wouldn't pretend to know how this is going to unfold, honestly. One thing I am certain of, having worked with Bob Mueller for a long time, is that we couldn't be in better hands in terms of having a really phenomenal and a man with such extraordinary integrity, dealing with this issue. And I look forward to seeing what else comes out of his, shop essentially on this issue. But I don't know.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.